right, welcome. So we are going to starting chapter 24, the history on Earth. We're going to start by talking about the geologic timescale, which is how we measure Earth's history because it's so long. So it's the division of history into ordered named periods. We base these names and these periods, basically we based on the major biotic and abiotic changes, and they billions of years. So we did the geological time into eons and now we're going to have to know the major eras. There are going to be some that you're going to need to know the name as they kind of come up during the semester. Maybe we're talking about a group that during that time, but you do not need to worry about like the period order they're in or anything like that. So don't worry about that. As far as the eons and the go, you will want to know, but fortunately they're pretty easy. And the useful device for the eons is here are perfect pizzas, right? For Archean, Proterozoic, and Phanerozoic. And just FYI, something that's useful to know is that the Proterozoic, so the Hadean, the eons collectively are referred to as the Precambrian. Might be a term useful. So you also need to know the theories of the Phanerozoic. And so it shouldn't be hard to remember, but it helps. A useful mnemonic is my children for the Zoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. So hopefully that can help. Resources have a little video resource on the geologic time also be helpful. So we actually come up with how old things are, right? There are two methods that we use, and one is called dating and the absolute dating. So as the name suggests, relative dating is an actual age of something. It's just how old something is relative. And we use stratigraphy to help us, stratigraphy to help us understand the relative ages of rock and the stuff in the rock. So stratigraphy is just the study of the layers of rock, or strata. So sedimentary rocks, which are rocks formed by the accumulation of sediment, are found in layers called strata. And the idea is that older strata and anything in them is going to be closer to the bottom, and more newly formed strata and anything in it will be closer to the top. So it's sort of like a pile of papers, right? Probably your most recent paper you wrote on is at the top of your pile, and your oldest paper is at the bottom of the pile. And so we can get a relative date of things in this method. Now, this doesn't actually tell us exactly what the age of something is, but absolute dating can actually give us a time frame. It can allow us to determine within some error the actual age of rock and anything in it. And we do this by taking advantage of radioactive isotopes. So how does that actually work? So what we call radiometric dating advantage of the fact that many common elements like carbon have radioactive isotopes. So for example, most carbon is carbon-12, that's what we're most familiar with, but there's also carbon-14, which is the radioactive isotope of carbon. And it decays at a regular interval. In other words, it's emitting particles and decaying to its decay product, which is nitrogen-14. So this happens at a very regular interval called its half-life. So the half-life is the amount of time it takes for half of the isotope to decay to its stable product. And this is very, very reliable. Right? If your half-life is 5,700 years, as is the case for carbon-14, it means that in 5,700 years, half of the carbon-14 will have decayed to nitrogen-14. And then in another 5,700 years, half of that half will have decayed. And then in another 5,700 years, half of the remaining half will have decayed. So because this is such a reliable time frame, we are able to compare the amount of the radioactive isotope, so 14C, to its stable decay product, 14 nitrogen, and actually get an idea of how old something is. So it can be very, very useful, and depending on how old we want to get, we would use different radioisotopes, right? Carbon is very useful for things that are 100 to 60,000 years old. If we want to get older than that, which we often do, we need to use a radioisotope that has a longer half-life. So something like uranium or potassium can help us go even further back in time. So those can be very, very useful things. Okay, so I want to change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about some stuff that happened in Earth's early existence. And particularly, we're going to focus on some of the physical events that have had a major impact on evolution. So by physical events, I mean geological or any kind of other physical process that has affected organisms on the planet. And all of these ones I'm going to talk about have been causes of both speciation, adaptation, and very importantly, mass extinction. And that's what you're looking at in this figure. You're looking at the red dots here are representing the 5 major mass extinctions we've had over the history of the Earth. And on the axis here we have percent of species going extinct. We're not going to talk about every one of these mass extinctions, but we are going to talk about a few of them, particularly the Permian mass extinction and the Cretaceous mass extinction. But all of these geological processes I'm about to list have had a hand in influencing at least some of these mass extinctions. So, and these processes are continental drift, one by that, climate change, or some kind of climate shift, volcanic activity, extraterrestrial events. I don't mean aliens visiting, I mean things like big old meteors hitting the planet, and changes in oxygen concentration. So let's talk first about continental drift. So the movement of the viscous mantle under the Earth, so if we look at the Earth in cross-section, we've got this really relatively thin crust and this viscous mantle underneath that is incredibly hot and is moving around and causing the crust, which exists in these plates called tectonic plates, to actually move around very slowly. And when these plates either slide past each other, one on top of the other, or maybe bump into each other or pull apart from each other, it can lead to some really important geological change. So we can get formation of mountains, we can get earthquakes, we can get volcanoes, faults, all these different sorts of geographic happenings where plates either collide, slide past each other, pull away from each other. Things like that. And by the way, these plates are still moving at a rate about approximately 2 centimeters a year. So that's too slow for us to feel it, but you can imagine over millions and billions of years that's going to make a big difference. And continental drift is what is responsible for moving the land masses around. So for example, I'm guessing you've probably heard about Pangaea, which was the supercontinent when all the continents were brought together in one big land mass down here during the Paleozoic. So continental drift brought these land masses together and then slowly started to bring them back apart. And this can be a big deal because the changing of the distribution of the land masses can trigger major climatic shifts. So this can trigger climatic shifts. It can change sea levels and definitely lead to mass extinctions. Another thing that continental drift does is promote allopatric speciation on a grand scale. So there's lots of organisms, both that exist just in the fossil record, as you're seeing in the figure above, whose distribution makes no sense unless we think of it in light of Pangaea, right? If we think about, oh wait, all these land masses were once together, and you can kind of see they still sort of fit together. The distribution we're seeing in these fossils makes sense in light of the continental drift. Also, the distribution of some living organisms, notably marsupials, right? We find them in Australia, and then we find a couple of marsupial species in the Americas. You look at that and you think, what? But it makes sense when we think about these all being together in one landmass. So let's talk about climatological shifts. So the Earth's climate has shifted from warmer to colder many times over its history, largely due to Earth's orbit and the planet's tilt, right, depending on how we are in relation to the sun. So during cold periods, what we might call an ice age, what happens is sea levels drop because water gets tied up in glaciers. And a drop in sea level can lead to mass extinction, especially of marine animals, right? You can imagine if suddenly the sea level drops massively, you're all of a sudden an aquatic organism on land. So that's a real problem. So that's one way a climate shift can lead to mass extinction. A climate shift can also lead to adaptation and speciation, as organisms perhaps have some kind of barrier, like a glacier separating them, that could lead to allopatric speciation, or organisms might start to adapt to survive a colder climate. Okay, volcanic activity. Now, most volcanic activity, at least that we're familiar with, is relatively small scale and doesn't have major global consequences, but there have been volcanic activity in the Earth's history that has caused a much more dramatic effect. So about 275 million years ago, in what would be the Permian, there was a multitude of volcanic eruptions happening at once, kind of a super duper eruption series. And this led to volcanic emissions that blocked sunlight globally, dropped the temperature as a result. Glaciers formed. As a result, sea level dropped. And this contributed substantially to the Permian mass extinction. Which was our most devastating mass extinction in the Earth's history. So, an extraordinary percentage of the organisms on the planet went extinct in the Permian mass extinction. And volcanic eruption is thought to be an important part, and the climate change that resulted are thought to be an important part of that. We also can have extraterrestrial events contributing to changes in the Earth, and thus changes in whoever's living there, including a mass extinction. So we're not talking about aliens visiting here, we're talking about big pieces of rock from space visiting here, such as a meteor. So probably one of the most famous mass extinctions is the Cretaceous. The Cretaceous mass extinction, which was approximately 65.5 million years ago. This is the one that killed off all the non-avian dinosaurs. And what happened is a big piece of meteor, about 10 kilometers in diameter, smacked near the Yucatan Peninsula and led to an explosion about the size of 100 million megatons of high explosives. So kind of a big deal. And what happened is the plume of debris that was thrown into the atmosphere was so profound that it blocked the sun, halted photosynthesis, and, as a result, cooled down the Earth, leading to climate change. And the biological consequences of this were profound. Something like 50% of all marine species and numerous families of terrestrial plants and animals, including the non-avian dinosaurs, all went extinct. And yeah, it was a huge change in the biology of the planet. And then finally here I want to talk about oxygen fluctuations, because this has been very important in the history of the Earth. So if we look at the very early history of the Earth, or at least the very early history of life on Earth, there wasn't any oxygen, or very, very little. And the early aquatic prokaryotes were the first to evolve the ability to photosynthesize about 2.4 billion years ago. So, we had our first photosynthesis. And then, once we had organisms photosynthesizing, and of course oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis, so we had sort of what was called an oxygen revolution. where we had this major upswing of oxygen production. Now, before this, what we call oxygen revolution, all living organisms were what we would call anaerobic. Which means that they did, extra E there, anaerobic, which means that they did not use oxygen for their metabolism. So what happened to these anaerobic is that lots of them died off because, in fact, oxygen was toxic to them. Those capable of surviving the new environment that had oxygen, what we would call aerobic, the new aerobic environment flourished. And this new aerobic environment led to new metabolic pathways. Very notably, cellular respiration, the process that actually uses oxygen to make ATP. Now, this new aerobic metabolism was really important because aerobic metabolism is much more efficient than anaerobic. Meaning that you get much more ATP per unit energy you're taking in. So this very likely led to the evolution of, allowed organisms to get much larger. They were able to use energy much more efficiently. So this oxygen revolution led to the lineages that gave rise to all modern life, all modern aerobic life. And it should be noted there are still some anaerobic organisms existing, right? Some anaerobic organisms did not die off with the oxygen revolution. Rather, they found a habitat that was free of oxygen and they did fine. And the continued elevation of O2 levels led to adaptive radiations. So we also got adaptive radiations of numerous aerobic lineages. So this would be a good example of some kind of evolutionary innovation leading to an adaptive radiation. Okay, that's all for this video. We'll pick up chapter 24, part 2 in just a minute.